fighter, and then the F-6F came out later on, and that was a folding wing. So the F-6 was designed primarily in order to get more aircraft on the aircraft carriers.
And we'll be back in a moment, and we'll look up close and personal at one of the great workhorse aircrafts of World War II, the B-25.
They're all around us. They're the men and women who served in our nation's armed forces. In good times and bad, they've been willing to stand in harm's way to preserve, protect, and defend the legacy of freedom we enjoy as Americans. All of them gave some, and some of them gave all. We owe them a lot. So the next time you see an American veteran, say thank you for all of us.
Welcome back to Military Memoirs. Our guest today is Mr. Robert C. Vernon, who was Master Sergeant Robert C. Vernon in the United States Marine Corps, World War II, in the Pacific. He was in charge of making sure that Marine aircraft at his base in the Pacific were able to fly 24 hours a day, and he was in charge of what was called the metal shop, where aircraft were kept serviceable and repaired and able to go. And the B-25 was the object of a lot of your focus in your job.
Yes, it was. In fact, it was probably the only focus that I had during the years that I was in the South Pacific.
This was a remarkable aircraft, I understand.
Yes, it was a great aircraft. If you've ever been in one and listened to it, it has an unusual sound. The engines, they were built by the Pratt Whitney aircraft organization in those days. They were 16-cylinder engines, and they had a sound like no other aircraft. You could be in your bunks and listen to the B-25 come over, and you knew what it was. And I know we often, when the groups were out and they were in combat, then when they would come back and fly over the field, they would buzz the field. They would let us know how many of the aircraft was coming back. So we would just count the buzzes, and we knew by the sound of the aircraft whether it was our squadron, whether it was a B-25, or they had other aircraft on the islands also.
Well, let's look at this aircraft maybe from nose to tail for a moment, since you're our expert on it. What about the armament? What kind of guns were in these typically?
Okay, well, the typical, we generally had 250 calibers in the tail section. We had 250 calibers in the turret. We had package guns, and package guns would have been guns that were mounted on each side, on the port and the starboard side,
up front,
up near the front, near the nose. And there were two of them. They were top and bottom on both sides, and then at a later time, then they come out with some 50 calibers that were mounted in the plexiglass nose itself. And in the original, I thought that they were probably more than I now know. I wrote to somebody in the squadron to find out how many 50 calibers that they had, and even that person was not sure. He said it depended upon the model, and he was thinking that there were 3 in the nose, and as I mentioned before, I don't think that there was an uneven number of 50 calibers, so they probably had 4 50 calibers there. So you really had a lot of firepower facing forward. You'd probably have the 4 in the nose, and then the 2 on the package, that's 6, 2 on the package, that's 8, and then there were 250s on the turret, and they could fire forward. They could fire 360 degrees. So you had a lot of firepower.
Well, this aircraft was used in Europe and in the Pacific theater. You were facing the Japanese.
Yes.
So how would they develop their attack strategy from the air on this aircraft, given that firepower?
Well, the only combat that I ever read about, the men or the pilots, when they came back, they wouldn't go into any detail about what had happened, and generally the flight crews wouldn't either. But some 20 years ago, I was able to read a textbook that was written by the grandson of one of the Japanese pilots, and he was in opposition to our particular squadron, and we had a pilot by the name of Lieutenant Hopper, and then the co-pilot was Lieutenant Lusky, and they were flying and ready to do some bombing runs, and there were 3 Japanese Zeros that was coming up behind them.
These are fighter aircraft.
These were the fighter aircraft, and the pilot knew that he couldn't outrun them. So he decided he was going to turn the plane around, and this is all identified in this textbook, that he did turn the aircraft around, and because he was now facing the Japanese Zeros, even though there were 3 of them, they ran. And
because of that firepower up front.
That was a very dangerous situation for them. Because
so they wanted to attack from the rear if they could.
They wanted to do that, but then he turned around and he foxed them out. So,
well, that would make it pretty hard on the tail gunner and the turret gunner.
Very dangerous
coming
for
in
them.
from the rear like that.
Right.
Typically flew a crew of how many?
6. We'd have the pilot, the co-pilot. You'd have a combination bombardier. Combination radar and a bombardier, and then you'd have the radio man, and often and the turret gunner and the tail gunner, and often you'd have a photographer that would go along for the ride, and they were in the aft end of the ship, and there are windows even in the model here. It shows windows that are on both sides, and those windows could be flipped up and opened up. And the photographer had 30 caliber that he could mount on the inside of the aircraft, and he could fire out those windows depending on which side of the aircraft that the enemy was firing on.
And how durable was this aircraft?
Wonderfully. It was just one of the most tremendous aircrafts. I think I mentioned to you, I was only in the aircraft one time when we lost an engine, and one of the pistons came out through the head of the engine, and also out through the cowling of the engine. And we lost that engine. We didn't lose the engine itself. We lost the power of the engine. And the propeller was already in its position to pull against the air. And because we couldn't change the position, they call it feathering, and that means that the propeller is facing directly into the atmosphere, and then it doesn't turn. Well, when it was still in that position where it could pick up air, it was shaking the aircraft, something fierce, and we dropped from 9,000 foot elevation down to less than 1,000 feet above the ocean, and by that time they were able to get the prop feathered, and so that the shaking stopped. And we were some 90 miles away from our base at that time.
On one engine? On
one engine, yes. And the pilot was really concerned with whether we would be able to continue with that altitude. There were trees on each end, and in fact all the way around the landing fields that were fairly high in the air. These are palm trees, so you had to get over those trees. So he talked to us all on the intercom. I was flying in the tail gunner's position. He talked to us and told us what he wanted us to do, and he wanted us to cut out all of the radio man's equipment, because there was a tremendous amount of weight in to throw it out through the bottom hatch. And there was an axe there. They have an axe that similar to for fire and things like that. So we were careful to not do any damage to the side of the fuselage, but we cut as much of the weight away in that radio man's equipment, and we threw that all out. We threw all of our suitcases out, whatever we had taken up there. We threw those out into the ocean, and we even threw the sextant. And the sextant was our